1991, the Gulf War. The military secretly injected soldiers with the soldier genes. The Gulf War syndrome that hundreds of thousands of returning soldiers complained about was a side effect of it.
Ha! Everyone knows that the Gulf War syndrome was caused by exposure to depleted uranium used in the anti-tank rounds.
That was just a cover story issued by the Pentagon. First they tried to say it was post-traumatic stress disorder, then chemical or biological weapons. The poison gas detection units and the anti-sarin injections, they were all just a cover-up of the secret genetic experiments.
So then, the so-called Gulf War babies that have been reported by Gulf War veterans are...
Yes, they too are our brothers and sisters.
In the closing days of the 20th century, war had changed. Smart weapons, next-gen special forces, and computer simulations had replaced the chaos and confusion of earlier eras with their mass conscription and clumsier tools of death and destruction. Combat in the 20th century, it seemed, would consist of something not only more voluntary, but also something cleaner and entirely substanceless. These tech-driven neo-colonial wars over natural resources are seen at the time as the start of a so-called benevolent hegemony, a Pax Americana, or American peace. Someday they will grow into prolonged forever wars, very profitable for military contractors, half disguised as counterinsurgency campaigns. But for now, the early 90s, it is still the revolution in military affairs. The future seems bright. It's a utopian revolution driven by technology, the same technology that helped win the Cold War, and that by 1998 will be sitting in modified form in living rooms and in arcade halls all over the world. This is a video essay on the war that changed all wars, that changed even peace. The war that gave us, both technologically and thematically, the backdrop for Hideo Kojima's Metal Gear Solid series, and along with it, arguably our entire society. That war was the one known then as the Iraq or Kuwait War, and/or Operation Desert Storm. The basic history lesson is this. In 1990, Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein invaded and annexed part of Iraq's neighboring state, Kuwait, to pay for his decade-long stalemate against Iran, a war which the United States played both sides of at different times. In targeting Kuwait, Hussein essentially took a huge portion of the world's oil supply hostage. The UN, spearheaded by the United States, then formed one of history's largest multilateral coalitions to militarily oppose him. Using what would be called the Powell Doctrine, the doctrine of concentrated, high-tech, overwhelming force, the U.S. military-led coalition quickly drove the Iraqi forces back across the border of Kuwait and won the war decisively. And that is all most people know about Desert Storm.
Tell me what you know.
He fought in the Gulf War as a teenager, the youngest person in the SAS. His job was to track down and destroy mobile Scud missile launching platforms. You were there too, I believe. Didn't you infiltrate Western Iraq with a platoon of Green Berets?
I was just a kid myself back then.
The details are classified, but it seems that originally he penetrated the Middle East as a sleeper for the SIS.
He was a spy for the British Secret Intelligence Service?
But he never once showed his face in Century House. He was taken prisoner in Iraq, and after that there was no trace of him for several years. After you retired, he was rescued and became a member of Foxhound.
But if you play Metal Gear Solid, you may remember Desert Storm as the war that both Solid and Liquid Snake cut their teeth fighting in, and also the one that the Pentagon used to begin the experiments that would produce in Metal Gear Solid the so-called Next Generation Special Forces, aka MGS-1's Genome soldiers. Well, this turns out to be, as we'll see, the perfect war for MGS to bring up by name, given the sci-fi military dystopian world of Metal Gear Solid and its fixation on the intersections between war, technology, and information control. Let's unpack why. One, the revolution in military affairs. Throughout modern military history, technology has all too often proved decisive in wars. The naive dream of the military-industrial complex going into the 1990s, and really starting in the 1980s if not late 70s, was that technology and that high-techification of global society would make American warfare popular again. The shift to a high-tech based battlefield, a shift that would change everything about the US military, even how it speaks, was all loosely known by the phrase, as I've said, the Revolution in Military Affairs, or RMA for short. The RMA concept began as a Soviet theoretical paradigm, actually, a theory of warfare, in other words, one largely based on the history of major game-changing technological advances, like, for instance, the nuclear bomb. Technology in the information age was allowing a revolution in things like smart weapons, tactical integration, and computer simulations on the battlefield for the first time. At the forefront of this shift, going back to the early 80s, was the age of so-called strategic computing, which gave rise to early AI principles and the dream of AI still alive today, according to the description of the book Strategic Computing, quote, to hasten the advent of machines that think. This revolution in military affairs paradigm began for the United States military in some ways as so-called net assessments of the Soviet Union under the direction of Pentagon legend Andrew Marshall. It was the dawn of the information age, after all, and more things were now quantifiable, modelable in digital simulations. This ushered in possibilities for a new era in battlefield command and control, for things like what Metal Gear Solid 5 correctly calls in modern military newspeak C2W, short for Command and Control Warfare. Desert Storm and its revolution in military affairs provided the testing ground for a host of experimental next-gen weapon systems and platforms, many of them in development for decades, all of them of direct relevance to MGS. Take the THAAD missile defense system, or the stealth bomber, or these pods that DARPA used for their SimNet simulated tank battles / LAN parties. To my eye, they look a lot like Rex's cockpit, don't they? Also, just take the M1 Abrams or the Harrier II. All these familiar weapon systems, and even fictional ones they inspired, like Metal Gear Rex or Arsenal Gear, all come from the Desert Storm era. A subtle reference you may have missed to Desert Storm by MGS1 happens in the briefing when Snake and Campbell briefly discuss how Desert Storm was where Solid and Liquid Snake first went into the field. Snake, we're told, was part of the infamous Scud Hunt, which ironically prefigured the phantom Iraqi WMD hunt of the early 2000s. After the Iraq War, there was a whole process that the UN went through to verify that Saddam Hussein had destroyed all of his WMD. To quote Scott Ritter's Iraq Confidential, during the Gulf War, Delta Force had been heavily engaged in counter-Scud operations in western Iraq, the so-called Great Scud Hunt. Their task had been the interception of Iraqi missile attacks against Israel, and despite several high-profile claims concerning destroyed Iraqi launchers, the fact that Iraq was able to strike Israel throughout the war represented a serious blow to the honor and prestige of a unit unaccustomed to failure. And there's this other part where he talks about a DIA analyst who, during Desert Storm, quote, had published numerous papers concerning the Iraqi Scud missile capability, and almost all of his assessments had turned out to be wrong. And now, in a secure conference room of the U.S. mission, he was getting ready to propagate another myth, the missing Iraqi Scud Brigade. He was postulating the existence of a covert force of Iraqi mobile launchers, some 24 of them which he believed were still unaccounted for. This is sort of the background that gave us Solid and Liquid Snake. It's the perfect setting for Solid Snake's first mission, as the real-world Scud Hunt was right on the borderline dividing fact and fiction. Also, Otacon tells Snake that he thinks Metal Gear Rex is an anti-missile platform, in other words, just like one of Desert Storm's high-tech weapons, the THAAD, or Terminal High Altitude Area Defense. It's a missile defense platform, basically. Desert Storm, as I sort of already touched on, saw the use of supersonic jets and next-gen tanks, both of which appear prominently in MGS. The M1 Abrams, brainchild of two-time SecDef Donald Rumsfeld, appears in MGS1, while the Harrier II appears in MGS2. The Hind that you fight in Metal Gear Solid 1 was, of course, a Russian gunship that was used during the Afghan-Soviet War. One last reference back to Desert Storm that I'll mention occurs in MGS2. The oil spill that takes place in Sons of Liberty likely refers to, among other things, the massive environmental damage that Saddam Hussein wrought on his way out of Kuwait. MGS1 also makes a lot, I should mention, of the mysterious Gulf War syndrome experienced by Desert Storm veterans after the war. In the real world, these symptoms were likely due to Saddam Hussein's use of chemical weapons against coalition forces. I should also mention that around the same time as Desert Storm, the National Institute of Health was conducting the biggest scientific collaboration since the Manhattan Project, the Human Genome Project. This attempt to map out the entire human genome was a major topic of relevance for both Metal Gear Solid 1 and Sons of Liberty. As explained by the book Strategic Computing, in the 1980s, as part of its bid to defeat Japan in the fields of computing and microelectronics and artificial intelligence, DARPA, or the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency, facilitated the commercialization of things like 3D graphics and the internet. Eventually, 3D technology made its way from flight and tank simulators from Desert Storm to arcade and home console video game machines like the Sony PlayStation. The same technology was also powering a revolution in Hollywood CG in films like Jurassic Park. This coming together of interests between Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and the Pentagon led to the creation of a new term, the Military Entertainment Complex. I've done a video on this, which you can check out here. Most people have no idea that the vast majority of the technology behind modern commercial products like video games is actually of military origin. As hinted at by Metal Gear Solid 4, by providing the public with access to such technology, the US military semi-privatized and civilized fields like computer graphics. Hard as it is to imagine, prior to the 80s and 90s, the government's technology was often light years ahead of the civilian world's. But just before, during, and after Desert Storm, so-called defense conversion enabled the Pentagon not only to transform global society technologically with its military-grade hardware, but to profit off doing so as well. Thanks to this revolution in military affairs, America finally shook off the so-called Vietnam syndrome, meaning its aversion to military adventurism and neo-colonialism, and video games provided the ultimate propaganda tool for this. In MGS, military computer systems and simulations work together to fabricate our entire social reality. DARPA reportedly gave some of the same network architecture they had used in SimNet, their Desert Storm-era tank simulation program, to Sony when it was first creating the Sony Online Network. I wanted to quote at length from Gameplay Mode. SimNet was the major DARPA simulation training technology project of the 1980s to 1990s and made critical innovations leading to remotely networked computer simulation in real time. SimNet made groundbreaking developments both for military sim training and for real-time multi-user simulation practices, including contemporary online gaming in networked virtual environments. These include the development of economically viable distributed interactive simulation hardware and software and associated computer graphics and communications advances. SimNet was in use by the U.S. Armed Forces by the end of the 1980s. Tank and armored vehicle units had extensive simulator training in preparation for the 1990 to 91 Gulf War. This war provided a highly valued opportunity to the U.S. military to test and review the effectiveness of its weapons technologies and simulation training regimes. Indeed, as Lowood and Lenore, among others, have pointed out, the entire Desert Storm campaign was based on plans developed in a war gaming simulation of the crisis that ran during the period after the occupation of Kuwait by Iraqi forces. In this manner, SimNet technology, first used to anticipate the conflict and prepare combat units to fight it, was utilized immediately after its conclusion as a means of recording. It is more accurate to say that the conflict was used by SimNet developers to review, refine, and improve its functioning as a training simulator. Lenore and Lowood examined the post-war efforts to develop a simulated reconstruction of an important tank battle from the short ground campaign of the Gulf War, the Battle of 73 Easting, named after a military map grid reference. Let me remind you that there is a song in Phantom Pain called Journey to Point C5. And if you actually go there in the game, that's a coordinate in the game on the game's map. And I think it's a reference back to this. The Battle of 73 Easting, named after a military map grid reference, took place early in the ground campaign between armored units of the U.S. and Iraqi armies and resulted in a decisive victory for the U.S. forces. The battle took place in a swirling sandstorm, but only U.S. units were equipped with infrared vision systems. This was one of the important determinants of the resulting destruction of Iraqi forces by U.S. armor that remained largely unscathed. Having trained soldiers for hundreds of hours on SimNet simulators as part of their preparation for the battle, the U.S. Army saw an opportunity to analyze the effectiveness of such training through a detailed simulation. Led by the Institute for Defense Analyses Simulation Center, or IDA, a team composed of SimNet project principals and contractors and assisted by the Army's engineer topographical laboratories, began to quote-unquote record the battle. This process involved the acquisition of every possible form of material record of the battle, at least from the side of the victors, for the purpose of constructing the simulation's database, including debriefings with U.S. Army participants, battle site surveys, action logs, recordings of radio transmissions, tape recordings, and diaries made by soldiers, overhead reconnaissance photography before and after the battle, observation records of battle wreckage locations, black box recordings from U.S. Army vehicles, tracks in the sand of vehicle and missile trajectories, and digital mappings of the terrain captured by radar and lasers. The simulation that was created on the basis of this recording effort could replay the course of the actual battle as one of its possibilities. It is the very raison d'etre of simulation techniques, however, to provide for the projection forward from initial conditions towards hypothetical futures. The value of the project was essentially as projective technique, not in its capability as a virtually enhanced staff ride over the battle space, illustrating what happened at different points in the battle. Lowood and Lenore state, as a computer simulation with programmable variables, the scenario could be replayed with different endings. They have this to say about how the project was seen by the IDA and the U.S. military. The Battle of 73 Easting was viewed as confirmation of Jack Thorpe's original vision for the SimNet of using networked simulation technology to use history to prepare for the future. It set the standard of a future genre of training simulations. The simulation provided a link with history, but at the same time, a dynamic interactive training vehicle for the future. End quote. Meanwhile, so-called Patriot missile systems and THAADs kept Hussein's Scud missiles in check. Smart bombs brought insanely great propaganda footage to American living rooms everywhere on new 24-hour news cycle channels like CNN. As you could virtually see for yourself this new age of warfare in all its precise, bloodless glory. Often aerial shots of airstrikes were broadcast in high-tech thermal mapping mode, which reduced the literal subject matter of life and death into something without substance. Something gray and monotone, antiseptic, and yet supposedly somehow benevolent. This was the era of the myth of the good war, the moral or humanitarian war, the benevolent hegemony. What few people at home realized was how much the entirety of Operation Desert Storm and the ensuing era was to some degree, in fact, an experiment in information control. Secretly, the US wanted a lot more than just to repel Iraqi forces out of Kuwait. They wanted, despite arming, funding, and supporting Iraq throughout their costly war against Iran in the 1980s, a so-called regime change. After driving Russia out of the Middle East by covertly backing the Afghan Mujahideen, or Holy Warrior movement, and thereby sowing the seeds that would eventually become the age of terrorism. After the Soviet-Afghan War, the US was tacitly now eyeing the region's vast mineral wealth for itself. The so-called petrodollar ensured that petroleum bought in US dollars would provide the world its entire standard of wealth for many years. Desert Storm was a foot in the door that would eventually pave the way for America's imperial phase, when it sought in effect to police the world's norms unilaterally. Crucial to it all would be the system of information control that we see satirized by Hideo Kojima in Metal Gear Solid. With its information control, its selection for societal sanity, or S3 plan in Metal Gear parlance, the US government would soon be able to capitalize on the most traumatic terrorist attack in history by throwing the American public into these forever wars in battlefields only tangentially related to the catastrophe at best. While invading and occupying the former invader and occupier Iraq, Americans were largely in the dark about things like the oil for blood scandal of the 1990s, which actually killed hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children, or things like the fact that the majority of their so-called intelligence on Iraqi WMD actually came from one extremely unreliable source by the codename of Curveball, or that Afghanistan's neighbor Pakistan was covertly providing crucial support to groups like Al-Qaeda and the Taliban, and individuals like Osama bin Laden, or that the Afghan insurgents had potentially unlimited resources given their control of the global heroin supply. Instead, the American people were told that terror lurked all around them, and that questioning the president or the Pentagon was tantamount to working covertly for the enemy, was downright unpatriotic, and leading this cultural shift away from the pacifism of the 60s and 70s into the militant crusader nationalist mentality of the early 2000s, arguably was modern technology, was things like video games. All of this background helps explain the MGS series as the quintessential sci-fi satire of the Desert Storm information age. War had never looked better or cleaner than during Desert Storm, and it would never look that way again. But now I'm going to quote at length from the philosopher Jean Baudrillard's seminal piece, The Gulf War Did Not Take Place. Quote, "Since this war was won in advance, we will never know what it would have been like had it existed. We will never know what an Iraqi taking part with a chance of fighting would have been like. We will never know what an American taking part with a chance of being beaten would have been like. We have seen what an ultra-modern process of electrocution is like. A process of paralysis or lobotomy of an experimental enemy away from the field of battle with no possibility of reaction. And this is not a war, any more than 10,000 tons of bombs per day is sufficient to make it a war, any more than the direct transmission by CNN of real-time information is sufficient to authenticate a war. One is reminded of the film Capricorn 1, in which the flight of a manned rocket to Mars, which only took place in a desert studio, was relayed live to all the television stations in the world. This war is an asexual, surgical war, a matter of war processing in which the enemy only appears as a computerized target. What is tested here in this foreclosure of the enemy, this experimental reclusion of war, Is the future validity for the entire planet of this type of suffocating and machinic performance, virtual and relentless in its unfolding? In this perspective, war could not take place. There is no more room for war than for any form of living impulse. War stripped of its passions, its phantasms, its finery, its veils, its violence, its images. War stripped bare by its technicians even, and then reclothed by them with all the artifices of electronics as though with a second skin. End quote. Desert Storm was just the first of 2 historic wars against Saddam Hussein. Check out my earlier video on Iraq and MGS5 for more about how the 21st century Iraq War influenced or prefigured elements in Ground Zeroes and the Phantom Pain. But as I've hopefully demonstrated, even if we just look at the first Gulf War in the 1990s, the relevance for Hideo Kojima's sci-fi military dystopian world of Metal Gear Solid couldn't be clearer. So that does it for our video on Desert Storm. Is there anything I missed, or that you guys want to hear more about? Let me know in the comments. Until next time, boss.